She arrived at the ranch under a sky the color of old steel, clutching a suitcase that felt heavier than it should have, because inside it were not clothes but expectations shaped by other people's bargains. And when the cowboy opened the door, he looked nothing like the man she had imagined during the long train ride west. Not cruel or distant or bored by obligation, but watchful, almost wary, as if he too had been delivered a fate he did not order. And that first second hooked her with a fear so sharp it hummed, because kindness, she knew, could be more dangerous than cruelty. He said her name softly, testing it, then stepped aside to let her pass, and the house smelled of wood smoke and soap, not loneliness, which unsettled her more than emptiness would have. Because warmth meant hope, and hope was what had ruined her before. At supper he asked nothing of her, not her past, not her body, not even her promises, and that silence pressed against her ribs like a held breath, while outside the wind worried the fences and somewhere cattle lowed, alive and restless. And she wondered when the coldness would begin. It did not begin that night, nor the next, nor the week after, and suspense crept in its place. A waiting that tightened every hour, because he rose before dawn, worked until dark, and treated her with a gentleness so careful it felt rehearsed, as if he were practicing for an audience that might condemn him if he failed. She watched him from doorways and windows, measuring the way he fed the horses before himself, the way he mended what broke without cursing, the way he listened to the land, and she began to suspect that this marriage was a shield for something he was hiding. The first shock came when she found the locked room at the end of the hall, its door scarred, its handle warm as if recently touched, and when she asked about it, he smiled without humor and said it was nothing, which was a lie so practiced it frightened her more than truth would have. That night she dreamed of chains and open fields, of hands offering water and then pulling away, and she woke to the sound of him shouting her name, because a fire had leapt from the stove and smoke clawed the ceiling, and he wrapped her in a blanket and carried her outside without hesitation, burning his own palms to keep her safe. In the cold morning air she saw blood on his hands and something else beneath it, a tremor of terror that did not belong to a man unafraid, and when she thanked him, he shook his head as if thanks were a debt he refused. The town came later with its eyes and whispers, with a woman who looked at her like a ledger, and a man who spat near her boots, and she realized then that the kindness she was living inside had a cost the world intended to collect. When she returned to the ranch, she opened the locked room, because suspense had grown claws, and inside she found letters stacked like coffins, names crossed out, dates marching backward, and a single photograph of a woman who looked like her if she had been braver, smiling beside the cowboy with a happiness that felt stolen. And the shock landed hard enough to steal her breath, because she understood then that she had married into a grave that was not yet finished. She stood there shaking, realizing the cold marriage she feared had never been his intention, that he was bracing for loss again. And when he appeared in the doorway, he did not shout or plead, only said that kindness was the only weapon he had left, because cruelty had already taken everything else, and in that moment destiny bent not toward comfort, but toward a reckoning neither of them could escape. As hoofbeats sounded outside and the past finally arrived, the door rattled, shadows stretched, and she knew the bargain that brought her here was about to be, rewritten in blood and fire. The men who rode in carried the past on their saddles, and the first gunshot cracked the air before she could step away from the window, shattering glass and the illusion that kindness alone could keep violence out. And the cowboy moved faster than fear, pulling her down, pressing her flat to the floor, his voice low and steady as he told her to stay no matter what she heard, which terrified her more than the gunfire because it sounded like farewell. The riders dismounted with the casual cruelty of men who believed time belonged to them, boots crunching gravel, laughter scraping the nerves, and one called the cowboy by a name she had never heard, a name thick with accusation. And when he answered from the doorway with his hands raised, she felt the suspense, not so tight it hurt to breathe. The leader spoke of debts and graves and a woman who had died screaming, and each word landed like a blow she could not block, because the photograph in the locked room now breathed between them, alive with context, and she understood that the kindness she had been given was not a disguise, but a vow forged in regret. When the men demanded he hand her over as collateral, the shock of it burned cold, because she realized the marriage contract that delivered her here had been meant to protect her, not claim her. And the cowboy refused without bravado, his voice almost gentle as he said no one would touch her. And that gentleness snapped something in the leader, who raised his gun and fired again, grazing the cowboy's shoulder. Blood bloomed dark and fast, and she screamed despite herself, breaking the rule he gave her. And that scream changed the rhythm of everything, because he staggered but did not fall, and in the chaos she crawled for the back door, heart pounding, mind racing with choices that felt like traps. Outside the barn loomed, the horse's restless eyes wide, and she cut one loose, hands shaking as she mounted with a grace born of terror. But before she could ride, she heard him shout her name, not in command but in plea, and she turned back because destiny, she realized, is often decided in the instant we refuse to run. She dismounted and dragged him behind the water trough as bullets chewed wood, pressing her scarf to his wound while he tried to apologize for bringing this to her door. And the absurdity of that apology cut deeper than fear, because it revealed how little he valued his own survival. The man advanced, confident, and she saw then that the locked room was not a tomb, but a ledger of justice he had been quietly building, names of those who had hurt women like her, dates marking when he had intervened. Evidence gathered patiently, and the woman in the photograph had not died screaming but testifying, and that lie had been planted to keep him isolated. Suspense tightened as the leader circled, boasting of how the town would never stand with a man like the cowboy, and she laughed, a sound that surprised everyone including herself, because she understood the final piece. The town had already chosen, and it was waiting for proof. She rose with her hands visible and spoke clearly, accusing the leader of murder and blackmail, naming the witnesses he thought buried, and as she spoke, the sheriff stepped from the trees with deputies fanned out, guns leveled, the shock on the riders' faces sharp and satisfying. The leader tried to run, was tackled, cursed her name, promised revenge, and she watched him disappear into iron and dust, feeling the tremor leave her bones at last. When silence returned, it felt fragile, and she knelt beside the cowboy as the deputies bound his shoulder, and he asked if she was hurt, still more concerned with her than himself, and she answered honestly that she was changed. That night, as rain stitched the land together again, she sat by his bed and read the last letter in the locked room aloud, the one where the woman thanked him for choosing kindness over killing, and he wept without shame, the shock of relief breaking him open, and she understood that the cold marriage she feared had never existed, only a crucible, and that destiny was not done testing them, because mercy always demands its price, and the final reckoning would come not from guns, but from a choice neither of them had yet dared to name. Morning came too clean, as if the land itself were pretending nothing had happened, and the quiet unsettled her more than gunfire ever had, because suspense does not die when danger leaves, it changes shape, and as the cowboy healed, she watched a new tension rise between them, one built from all the words they were not saying. The town returned to its routines with practiced indifference, but she noticed the way doors opened more easily for him now, the way people met his eyes, and she understood that justice had shifted something irreversible. Still, the cold marriage hovered like a ghost they refused to name, because kindness, when left unspoken, can rot into distance, and she feared that once his wound closed, he would retreat behind duty and gratitude and send her away with money and apologies. That fear sharpened when she overheard him speaking with the sheriff about selling the ranch, about leaving before trouble found them again, and shock rippled through her because she realized she had mistaken his gentleness for attachment when it might only be penance. That night she packed her suitcase, every fold of fabric a small betrayal, and placed it by the door, telling herself that destiny did not need her consent to move on. He found it at dawn and said nothing, only brewed coffee and waited. And the silence pressed so hard it felt like a verdict when she finally spoke, accusing him of planning to erase her from his life, the way he had erased his own happiness. He did not deny it, and that honesty cut deeper than lies, because he said kindness had already destroyed one woman he loved, that sheltering others was safer than wanting them. The suspense snapped then, because she understood the true danger was not the world but his fear of joy, and she told him she had not arrived to be protected or pitied, that the bargain which brought her here had been rewritten. The moment he burned his hands to save her, and that destiny, if it meant anything, demanded risk. He listened with that same careful attention he gave the land, and for a moment she thought she had failed, because his face closed and he turned away, walking toward the locked room. The shock came when he opened it wide and began tearing down the letters, burning them in the stove one by one, not in anger but release. And when he returned, he placed the photograph in her hands and said the woman had died free, not because of kindness but because she chose it, and he had loved her enough to accept that cost. Then he asked her the question he had been avoiding since the first night. Not whether she would stay, but whether she wanted to be his wife in truth, not as shelter or bargain, but as equal, knowing the danger, choosing it anyway. Her answer was not spoken, because before she could respond, the past made its final move, arriving not on horseback but in ink, as a telegram slid under the door, announcing the leader's escape during transfer and naming the ranch as his destination. Fear surged, sharp and familiar, but something else rose stronger, a calm born of clarity, and she told the cowboy to finish the coffee because running would only make them smaller. They prepared together, not with guns alone but with the town, who came when called, carrying resolve instead of fear. And when the leader arrived at dusk, he found not a lone man hiding behind kindness, but a woman standing beside him hand in hand, unflinching. The confrontation was brutal and brief, ending not with a shot but with the leader's own confession shouted in desperation and recorded by the sheriff, the truth finally devouring the lie that sustained him. As he was taken away again, screaming curses that fell flat, the land echoed something like peace. That night she unpacked her suitcase slowly, deliberately placing it empty under the bed, and when she lay beside the cowboy she felt the weight she carried into this marriage finally lift. The ending, she realized, was not safety or certainty, but choice, renewed every day, and as he held her with hands no longer shaking, she understood that the cold, lifeless marriage she had expected had never existed at all, because destiny had not changed her through kindness alone, but through the courage to accept it, and that was the most dangerous, satisfying truth of all.